17. Alone in Paris, living in the apartment of one of the most powerful men in the European modeling world, because that's where her agency sent her. She barely spoke the language, didn't understand the contracts, and had no parent or advocate on set. The man who controlled her career was also the man she couldn't escape. Carre Otis was one of the biggest supermodels of the 1990s. Vogue, Guess, Calvin Klein, runways in Milan and Paris. Her face sold the fantasy of glamour to millions of women around the world. But behind the photographs, behind the magazine covers, was a reality the industry never wanted anyone to see. For decades, she stayed silent. Then, she decided to talk.
Set the record straight. Did Mickey beat you?
There was abuse, and there was enough of abuse to call it abuse.
This is the story of how the fashion industry failed Carre Otis, and how decades later, she became the one trying to tear it open. Carre Otis was not living the stable suburban life that makes for a clean origin story. She had run away from home. She had dropped out of school. She was, by her own later account, already navigating a chaotic adolescence when a scout from Look Model agency spotted her in San Francisco. What happened next moved fast. She signed with Look, then with Elite Model Management, one of the most powerful agencies in the world at the time. By April 1986, she had her first major cover, French Elle. She was not yet 18. The industry saw something in her face. High cheekbones, a certain intensity in her eyes, a look that photographers wanted to capture. What the industry did not see, or did not care to see, was the girl behind the face, a teenager without a high school diploma, without a parent on set, without anyone whose job it was to ask whether she was okay. In the modeling world of the 1980s, this was not unusual. Agencies routinely signed girls in their mid-teens. Legal emancipation, a court process that gave minors adult status, was common because it made international travel easier. A 16-year-old who was legally emancipated could fly to Paris or Milan without a guardian's signature. She could sign her own contracts. She could live alone in a foreign country. The system was designed for efficiency. It was not designed for protection. Carre fit the mold perfectly. Young, beautiful, unattached, and willing to go wherever the work was. Elite saw a girl who could sell anything. No one asked what might happen to her once she got there. In the years that followed, Carre would look back on this moment and recognize it for what it was, the beginning of a trap disguised as an opportunity. She had no frame of reference for what a legitimate modeling career should look like. She had no advocate, and the people who were supposed to guide her had their own interests in mind. The speed of her ascent made everything feel inevitable. Within months of being scouted, she was boarding international flights, meeting with photographers whose names she barely knew, signing documents she did not fully understand. Adults around her told her she was lucky. They told her this was the dream, and she believed them. Because what else did she have to compare it to? To understand what happened to Carre Otis, you have to understand what the modeling industry looked like in the 1980s. It was not regulated like film or television. There were no union protections, no mandatory chaperones for minors, no standardized contracts. Agencies operated with enormous power over their models, controlling their bookings, their payments, their housing, sometimes even their diet. Carre later described it as the Wild West, an environment where young women had almost no leverage and older men had almost no accountability. When Elite sent her to Paris, they did not arrange for her to stay in a hotel or a supervised model apartment. Instead, she was placed in the home of Gerald Marie, the head of Elite Model Management's Paris division. He was one of the most powerful men in fashion. In later accounts, Carre would describe his behavior toward her as deeply abusive. She was 17, he was in his 40s, and she was living under his roof. At the time, Carre believed the arrangement would be beneficial for her career. That was what she had been told. Marie was connected. Marie could open doors. Marie would take care of her. What she did not know, what no one told her, was what that arrangement would actually cost. In her memoir and later legal filings, Carre described a period marked by physical and emotional mistreatment. She wrote that Marie controlled every part of her life, her finances, her housing, even her access to work. She also wrote that he pushed her toward extreme weight loss methods common in an industry obsessed with thinness, and that he exposed her to other powerful men in Europe who held sway over her future. One account recalls Marie slapping her and demanding obedience, insisting she owed him compliance because he was supporting her. Whatever he believed their relationship to be, the dynamic she remembered was not mentorship. It was control. Her lawsuit also stated that elite executive Trudy Tapscott arranged for her to live with Marie, and that elite co-founder John Casablancas approved the setup. Whether those executives understood the situation or simply didn't look too closely, the effect was the same. A teenage girl was sent abroad with no safeguards, placed in the home of the man who dictated her career. Carre's descriptions appear in her 2011 memoir and in a 2021 lawsuit. Marie has denied wrongdoing, but what is not in dispute is the structure that made such allegations possible. A teenage girl, alone in a foreign country, housed with the man who controlled her career. No oversight, no one checking in, no system in place to catch what might be going wrong. When Carre turned 18 and began to resist Marie's control, she says he kicked her out of his apartment. She was on her own, but at least now she had a foothold in the industry. Her face was known. Her bookings continued. The machine kept running. What Carre learned during this period would stay with her for the rest of her life. That the fashion industry created a huge power imbalance between agencies and young models. That teenage girls were often legally emancipated to make travel easy, yet remained unchaperoned and vulnerable. That the myths of modeling, that it was well-paid, safe, glamorous, were exactly that. Myths. By the late 1980s, Carre Otis was everywhere. French Elle, American Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Cosmopolitan, Marie Claire. She moved through the top fashion magazines with ease. Her breakout guest campaign helped turn her into a household name, and later Calvin Klein put her image on billboards across the world. One of her posters even appeared in the background of National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. A small detail, but a reminder of how ubiquitous her face had become. She walked runways for Gucci and Dolce & Gabbana. She jetted between New York, Paris, and Los Angeles. She was, by the standards of the industry, a success, the picture of 90s supermodel glamour. The covers kept coming. The campaigns kept coming. Her face sold jeans and perfume and the idea that beauty was effortless, that modeling was a fantasy life. The photographs showed a woman who seemed untouchable. What they did not show was the reality behind them. And yet, none of this success translated into safety. The same years that saw her face on magazine covers were the years she later described as the most painful of her life. She was struggling with disordered eating, a direct result, she said, of industry pressure to maintain an impossibly thin frame. She was dealing with the aftermath of what she says happened in Paris, and she had no one to tell. The pressure to stay thin was relentless. Carre later revealed that she had battled anorexia throughout her modeling career, starving herself to meet the industry's weight demands. It was not a personal failing, it was a job requirement. The agencies wanted a certain look, the designers wanted a certain silhouette, and Carre, like countless other models, destroyed her health trying to deliver it. This is the paradox that Carre would later try to explain to the public, that visibility is not the same as protection, that being famous does not mean being safe, that the industry could celebrate your image while ignoring your humanity. She was a face that sold products. What happened to the person behind the face was not the industry's concern. In 1989, she got a role in a film called Wild Orchid. It was not a critical success, but it introduced her to her co-star, Mickey Rourke. He was a Hollywood leading man known for intense roles and an unpredictable personality. They began a relationship that would define the next decade of her life, and not in the way a romance is supposed to. Carre married Mickey Rourke in 1992. From the outside, it looked like a glamorous pairing, the supermodel and the movie star living in Los Angeles, attending premieres photographed together at events. From the inside, according to Carre, it was something else entirely. In interviews after the marriage ended, Carre described the relationship as volatile and dangerous. She said there was violence. She said there was control. In one interview with Entertainment Tonight, she acknowledged it directly. There was abuse, and there was enough of it to call it abuse. One incident in particular stood out. At some point during the marriage, a gun that Rourke kept in their home discharged accidentally. The bullet went through Carre's body. She survived, but she carried the physical evidence of that night for the rest of her life. She later said the incident was traumatic for both of them. She did not describe it as intentional, but she did describe it as part of a pattern, a relationship in which danger was always present, in which she never felt fully safe. Rourke carried a revolver in their home. Carre had traded one dangerous situation for another. The marriage also affected her career in ways that illustrated how little control she had over her own life. According to one account from a modeling industry veteran, Carre once had to turn down $1 million cosmetics deal because Rourke insisted she reject it. Even her professional decisions were not fully her own. The marriage lasted 6 years. They divorced in 1998, and when Carre later wrote about her experiences in her memoir, Rourke responded publicly. He went on Piers Morgan Tonight and dismissed the book as sour grapes, accusing it of coming from what he called a delusional, narcissistic point of view. He suggested she was chasing money and attention. He rejected her version of events entirely. This would become a recurring theme in Carre's life, telling her story and being told she was wrong, speaking her truth and being called a liar. The people she accused had platforms too, and they used them. By the end of the 1990s, Carre Otis was no longer the girl on the magazine covers. She was a woman in crisis. The years of trauma had accumulated. The disordered eating had worsened. She had developed dependencies on substances, a way of coping with pain she could not otherwise manage. Her marriage had ended. Her career had stalled. She was, by her own account, barely surviving. She stepped away from the fashion industry. She moved to California, then Colorado. She lived quietly, out of the spotlight, trying to rebuild a life that had been shattered by forces she was only beginning to understand. This period was not glamorous. It was not the stuff of magazine profiles. It was the hard, unglamorous work of recovery, therapy, sobriety, learning to eat again, learning to trust again. Carre later spoke about these years with honesty. She had been broken, and putting herself back together took a long time. For a while, she joked that she had nothing left. No contracts, no campaigns, no industry relationships worth preserving. But in that emptiness, she found something unexpected. Freedom. Freedom to think about what had happened to her. Freedom to question the system that had shaped her life. Freedom to decide what she wanted to do next. She also began to understand that what had happened to her was not just personal misfortune. It was systemic. The industry that had made her famous had also left her vulnerable. The agencies that had profited from her image had done nothing to protect her. The men who had hurt her had faced no consequences. But something else was happening during this period. Carre was starting to see her own story differently, not as a personal failure, but as a symptom of a larger problem. Not as something that happened because she was weak, but as something that happened because the system was broken. The industry had no protections for teenage models. Agencies operated without oversight. Powerful men faced no consequences. And girls like her, girls who came from difficult backgrounds, who had no one watching out for them, were the ones who paid the price. By the time Carre emerged from this period, she had a new sense of purpose. She was not just going to survive, she was going to speak. In October 2011, Carre Otis published a book called Beauty Disrupted. It was a memoir, co-written with a journalist, and it told the story she had kept silent for more than 2 decades. She wrote about her teenage years in Paris. She wrote about Gerald Marie. She named him directly and described what she says he did to her. She wrote about the industry's culture of silence, the way young models were treated as commodities, the absence of any system to protect them. She wrote about her marriage to Rourke, the violence, the gun, the fear. She wrote about her struggles with eating disorders and substances, the coping mechanisms that had nearly killed her. It was the first time she had told the full story publicly, and it came with a cost. Rourke, as mentioned, went on television to deny everything. He called the memoir the product of a delusional mind, He questioned her motives and her sanity. Some people in the fashion industry distanced themselves from her. She was no longer a working model. She had no contracts left to lose, but she still faced the social and professional consequences of speaking out. In an interview at the time, Carre acknowledged this directly. She told the San Francisco Chronicle that she felt she could finally speak freely because she had nothing left to protect. No campaigns to lose, no relationships to preserve. The industry had already moved on from her, and that, paradoxically, gave her freedom. As she put it, now that she had no modeling contracts to lose, she could speak out more freely. She also joined the advisory board of the Model Alliance, a nonprofit organization founded to advocate for models' labor rights. She became an ambassador for the National Eating Disorders Association. She began giving interviews not to promote her career, but to warn young women about what the industry could do to them. The memoir was a turning point. It transformed Carre from a former model into an activist. She was now, as one profile described her, a role model for change, using her platform to expose the sordid side of modeling that the industry preferred to keep hidden. She was busy unraveling what she described as unsavory practices within the industry, and she was doing it in public. During this period, Carre also began reclaiming her career on her own terms. She transitioned to plus-size modeling as she recovered from anorexia, a deliberate rejection of the industry's demand that women starve themselves to stay employed. It was a small act of defiance, but a meaningful one. But it also marked the beginning of a much longer fight, one that would take another decade to show results. After Beauty disrupted, Carre Otis did not retreat back into private life. She became a public voice for industry reform. In 2018, she publicly backed the Talent Protections Act in California, a bill that, among other things, requires talent agencies to provide sexual harassment and safety training and information on issues like eating disorders to the performers they represent. Advocates used stories like hers to argue that the industry routinely sent teenagers abroad without chaperones, let agencies control models' finances, and offered almost no recourse when things went wrong. She also threw her support behind a more ambitious piece of legislation, the Fashion Workers Act in New York. Backed by the Model Alliance and other advocacy groups, the bill is designed to close loopholes that let management companies and agencies avoid responsibility for exploitation and wage theft, and to extend basic labor protections to models, protections that workers in most other industries already expect. The fashion industry pushed back. Major agencies and management companies have lobbied against the bill, arguing that existing rules are enough and that new regulation would be burdensome. Carre has joined Sarah Ziff and other advocates in promoting the act, lending her story to interviews, open letters, and campaign events. As of late 2024, the Fashion Workers Act had gained strong support in Albany but had not yet been signed into law, making it a live battleground for the reforms she has spent years demanding. Her advocacy was not limited to legislation. She spoke at conferences, met with policymakers, and used her platform to amplify the voices of other survivors. In 2021, she appeared at a press conference in Paris, speaking on behalf of models and survivors about the abuses they had endured under unregulated industry practices. She had become a symbol of what it meant to fight back against an industry that had harmed her, not with anger, but with persistence. Her advocacy has started to be acknowledged inside the industry, even if slowly. She has been profiled as a role model for change and invited by groups like the Model Alliance, the National Eating Disorders Association, and other organizations to speak about what went wrong and how to fix it. The invitations themselves are a sign that parts of fashion are finally willing to hear what women like her have been saying for years. But recognition was not the same as justice. And justice for Carre required one more step. In August 2021, Carre Otis, filing under her legal name, Carre Sutton, brought a civil lawsuit against Gerald Marie, Trudy Tapscott, and others connected to elite model management. The suit was filed under New York's Child Victims Act, a law that extended the statute of limitations for survivors of childhood abuse. In the complaint, Carre says that Tapscott, an elite executive, arranged for her to live with Marie in Paris when she was 17. She says elite co-founder John Casablancas signed off on the plan. In that filing, she describes Marie repeatedly abusing his power over her, controlling her finances, and passing her to other powerful men, all while she was still a minor. The lawsuit also states that Carre was never paid for her work during this period, effectively trapping her in a situation of financial dependency. The defendants denied the allegations, and in 2022, the lawsuit was dismissed on procedural grounds. The court ruled that New York's Child Victims Act did not apply to abuse that occurred outside the United States. Carre appealed. In November 2024, the U.S. Court of Appeals reversed the dismissal. The court ruled that the Child Victims Act could apply to her case, even though the abuse she described happened in France. The lawsuit was allowed to proceed. Carre released a statement calling the ruling a huge win, not just for herself, but for all survivors who had been told their cases came too late. She noted that it had been 13 years since she first named her abuser publicly in Beauty Disrupted. 13 years of fighting, nearly 4 decades since the abuse itself. The legal system had finally opened a door. In her statement, Carre also returned to the theme that had driven her advocacy for over a decade. She wrote that the widespread mistreatment of young people in the fashion industry had gone largely unchecked for decades. She pointed out that models continue to work without basic labor protections in an industry long known for tolerating people who exploit their power. She noted that the global fashion industry generates $2.5 trillion in revenue, yet the workers who make that revenue possible often have no contracts, no wages, and no legal recourse. She urged New York's governor to sign the Fashion Workers Act to prevent what happened to her from happening to the next generation. The case is ongoing. Marie, now in his 70s, has continued to deny her account. Many of the executives Carre named are beyond the reach of prosecution due to time limits or jurisdiction. Elite model management itself has declined to comment. The industry has made incremental changes but remains largely unregulated, and yet something has shifted. Carre's willingness to speak, first in her memoir, then in her advocacy, now in court, has forced a conversation that the fashion world spent decades avoiding. Other models have come forward with their own stories. Journalists have investigated. Legislators have acted. Her case could set a precedent for other survivors who were previously unable to sue. The system that failed Carre Otis is beginning, slowly, to change. Carre Otis is in her mid-50s now. She lives in California with her husband, Matthew Sutton, whom she married in 2005. They have 2 children. She no longer walks runways or appears on magazine covers, though she has done occasional work as a plus-size model, a quiet rejection of the industry's insistence that women must be impossibly thin. She has also been working on a second book about intimacy and relationships, continuing to share what she has learned from her own difficult journey. Her life today looks nothing like her life in 1986. And that, she has said, is the point. In interviews, Carre has talked about what drove her to speak out after so many years of silence. She has said that coming from a history of violence, you have to find a way to turn it around. You have to find a way to empower young women. You have to take what was done to you and transform it into something that protects the people who come after. She has worked to dispel the myths that still surround the industry, myths like the idea that models are naturally extremely thin, or that teenagers are treated respectfully behind the scenes. These were lies she had lived through, and she wanted to make sure the next generation knew the truth. The fashion industry sold Carre Otis's image for decades. Her face moved products, filled magazines, built brands. What it could not sell was her silence, at least not forever. When she finally spoke, she did not do it for revenge. She did not do it for money. She did it because she believed that telling the truth was the only way to change a system that had been allowed to operate in darkness for too long. The cost was high. She lost her career. She lost relationships. She endured public attacks from her ex-husband and skepticism from people who had known her professionally. She spent years in recovery from trauma that the industry inflicted and then ignored. But she also gained something. She gained the knowledge that her story had mattered, that her testimony had helped pass laws, that her lawsuit had set a precedent for other survivors, that her refusal to stay quiet had contributed to an industry reckoning that was long overdue. In 2024, when the appeals court revived her case, Carre wrote that she hoped to give future models the protections they needed. The protections she never had. She said that if even one girl avoids what she went through, it would make everything worth it. The fashion industry is still not fully regulated. People who exploit that power still exist. Young models are still vulnerable. The work is not finished. But Carre Otis opened a door, and she is not the only one walking through it anymore.